Stephen Walker, the capture of a serial killer. On a humid summer evening, two Milwaukee police officers were on a routine patrol through an area located around Marquette University. The high-crime region of North 25th Street was pungent that night, with garbage in the streets, urine and feces from the homeless, and the leftovers of the many restaurants, meaning the stink of the neighborhood in that oppressive heat was almost unbearable. That night, July 22, 1991, at around midnight, the officers were sat in their car when they suddenly saw a short, skinny black man running fast in their direction. What stood out immediately was the handcuff that dangled from his wrist. At first, they thought he might have escaped custody from another officer and asked him what he was doing. The man, 32-year-old Tracy Edwards, told them a strange story about someone he referred to as a weird dude and freak who had put the cuffs on him at an apartment. The officers at first suspected some sort of homosexual argument had taken place, an incident they would normally avoid. However, as the young man seemed panicked and genuine, they decided to check it out. The officers, Robert Roth and Ralph Mueller, drove Edwards to the man's apartment, which was not far at the Oxford Apartments at 920 for North 25th Street. They hoped to retrieve the keys to the handcuffs, as their own did not unlock them, and settle what they thought was a lover's dispute. Arriving at the door to apartment 113, the officers were greeted by a pleasant-looking blonde man. The man appeared calm and rational, and when asked about the handcuffs, he offered no explanation about why he placed them on Edwards. It was at this point that Edwards told the officers the man had brandished a knife when they went to the bedroom. When Officer Mueller entered the bedroom, the blonde man attempted to push past to retrieve the key. At this point, Roth told the man to back off, and Mueller continued to look under the bed. There, he found a large knife hidden beneath the bed. Reaching over to where a chest of drawers stood next to the bed, he opened the top drawer. Inside, he saw something he couldn't quite comprehend at first. It contained Polaroids, dozens of them, scattered inside. When he looked closer, he saw they depicted human bodies, many of which were in different stages of dismemberment. Some showed skulls in the refrigerator, and all appeared to have been taken within the apartment they were standing in. Mueller grabbed a handful and walked out of the bedroom and showed them to his partner, telling him, "These are for real." Stephen Walker, the head in the fridge. When the placid blonde man saw one of the officers holding the Polaroids, his demeanor suddenly changed. He became angry and started fighting the police, but was quickly overpowered by the two officers and cuffed with his hands behind his back. They called for backup, and then Mueller recalled the Polaroid showing the skull in the refrigerator. He walked over to where it was and pulled open the door. He recoiled when he saw a face staring back out at him from a freshly severed head of a black male propped up on the bottom shelf. Mueller slammed the door and turned around. "There's a fucking head in the refrigerator." As the blonde man lay pinned beneath Roth, he turned his head toward the officers and muttered, "For what I did, I should be dead." The blonde man, identified as 31-year-old recently unemployed chocolate factory worker Stephen Walker, appeared to live alone at the apartment. The officers placed him under arrest and read him his Miranda rights. They didn't know it yet, but Officers Mueller and Roth had just apprehended one of the most terrifying serial killers in American history. Stephen Walker, a normal childhood. Born on May 21, 1960, in Milwaukee to Lionel and Joyce, Stephen Walker was very much wanted and adored by his parents. Despite the difficulties of his mother's pregnancy, Stephen grew into a normal, healthy, and happy child who always loved to play with his wooden blocks and stuffed bunnies. Little Stephen gave his parents no cause for concern. He soon developed into a cheerful boy, although he did suffer an unusual number of ear and throat infections during his childhood. He loved animals, especially the family dog Frisky, his much-loved pet. Lionel recalled how they once released back into the wild a bird the three had nursed back to health after it suffered an injury. "I cradled the bird in my cupped hand, lifted it into the air, then opened my hand and let it go. All of us felt a wonderful delight," Lionel remembered. Stephen's eyes were wide and gleaming. It may have been the single happiest moment of his life. During his childhood, the family moved to Iowa, where Lionel worked on his Ph.D. at Iowa State University. Lionel, who was of German and Welsh ancestry, was a Marquette University chemistry student and later a research chemist, while Joyce, who had Norwegian and Irish ancestry, worked as a teletype machine instructor. Although his parents were generally happy, Joyce was known to be argumentative with both her husband and neighbors. Lionel shared an incident from Stephen's childhood, something that happened when he was 4 that had a profound effect on the young boy. His father was sweeping out from under their house one day the remains of some animals that had been killed by civets. As Lionel gathered the tiny animal bones, he remembers how Stephen seemed oddly thrilled by the sound they made. His small hands dug deep into the pile of bones. I can no longer view it simply as a childish episode, a passing fascination. The same sense of something dark and shadowy, of a malicious force growing in my son, now colors almost every memory. At the age of 6, Stephen suffered from a double hernia and required an operation to correct the problem. His parents saw a change in him after this, and he never seemed to recover the same energy he had before. He seemed smaller, somehow more vulnerable. He grew more inward, sitting quietly for long periods, hardly stirring, his face oddly motionless. Because Lionel's studies kept him away from home for most of the day, the young Stephen Walker was left to the care of his mother, who had been described as a hypochondriac who suffered from depression. When Lionel was home, Joyce would demand his constant attention, spending most of the day in bed. This meant young Stephen was often left to his own devices. During one of their many arguments, she one day attempted suicide with Equino. Stephen would later comment upon his childhood how lonely he was because neither parent spent much time with him. He described feeling unsure of the solidity of the family and recalled there being much tension and arguments between his parents during his early years. In 1966, his father had completed his graduate work in Iowa and secured a job as a research chemist in Akron, Ohio. By that time, Joyce was pregnant with their second son, David, and Stephen was undergoing a change that his parents noticed. It was like a strange fear had begun to creep into his personality, a dread of others that was combined with a general lack of self-confidence. He was developing a reluctance to change, a need to feel the assurance of familiar places. The prospect of going to school frightened him. The little boy who'd once seemed so happy and self-assured had been replaced by a different person, now deeply shy, distant, nearly uncommunicative. Lionel Walker suspected the move from Iowa had had a greater effect on his son than he had realized, and considered it a normal reaction to being uprooted from his familiar settings and faced with entirely new ones. Considering Lionel to had suffered from shyness and insecurity, and had grown introverted when he was a child before eventually overcoming it, gave him an understanding of what his son was experiencing. Stephen Walker, a strange metamorphosis. Lionel believed Stephen would overcome these hurdles in much the same way he had done, but he failed to realize that his son's childhood peculiarities were far more serious. Looking back, he recalled, Stephen had begun to suffer from a near isolation. He soon developed a friendship with a boy named Lee and became fond of one of his teachers. One day, young Stephen took her a bowl of tadpoles he had caught. When he later discovered the teacher had given them to his friend Lee, Stephen sneaked into Lee's garage and killed the tadpoles with motor oil. His father also noticed a change in his physical appearance and demeanor over time. His posture and the general way in which he carried himself changed radically between his 10th and 15th years. The loose-limbed boy disappeared and was replaced by a strangely rigid and inflexible figure. He looked tense, his body very straight. He grew increasingly shy during this time, and when approached by other people, he would become very tense. More and more, he remained at home, alone in his room or staring at television. His face was often blank, and he gave the more or less permanent impression of someone who could do nothing but mope around, purposeless and disengaged. He only seemed to have one friend, but the two drifted apart when Stephen turned 18. It was around this time that Lionel discovered an unsettling aspect of his son's nocturnal habits. He found out that Stephen would ride around with plastic bags and collect the carcasses of small animals, squirrels, chipmunks, and other roadkill which he used for his own private cemetery. He would strip the flesh from the bodies of these putrescent roadkills and even mount a dog's head on a stake, Lionel said. There was the worry that Stephen might be torturing and killing animals, but his father considered this unlikely, given how much he adored the family dog and cat. Still, it was clear Stephen Walker held a deep and disturbing fascination with dead creatures. Even when Stephen asked his father innocuously over dinner one evening what would happen if chicken bones were placed in bleach, Lionel Walker considered it merely the harmless scientific curiosity of a young boy. He went on to demonstrate to his son how to safely bleach and preserve animal bones, which Stephen began doing to his own collection of remains. One of his friends later recalled how Stephen explained that he was curious how animals fit together. One friend was shown the carcass of a dog that had been impaled by its skull to a stick. Stephen claimed he had simply found it, but later it was learned he had decapitated the dead animal and placed it in the woodland behind his house as a prank. Stephen Walker, descent into fantasy. In exploring his strange obsession with the dead, Stephen Walker grew increasingly isolated and his personality more passive. His conversation narrowing to the practice of answering questions with barely audible one-word responses, his father recalled. He was drifting into a nightmare world of unimaginable fantasies. In coming years, those fantasies would begin to overwhelm him. The dead in their stillness would become the primary objects of his growing sexual desire. His inability to speak about such strange and unsettling notions would sever his connections to the world outside himself. While other young boys his age were looking to pursue further education, careers, or start families of their own, Stephen appeared more or less completely unmotivated. He must have come to view himself as utterly outside the human community, outside all that was normal and acceptable, outside all that could be admitted to another human being. For Lionel Walker, there was little indication of the fantasies emerging in his teenage son's mind about death and dismemberment. With no outer signs of mental illness, it appeared to the family that Stephen was just becoming more and more isolated and uncommunicative. He never rebelled against his parents because, it seemed, nothing ever seemed to mean anything to him. Stephen Walker, high school outcast. As a freshman at Revere High School, Stephen Walker was considered an outcast by his peers. With his mother taking increasing amounts of medication and isolating herself from both her husband and son, Stephen began coping with his own deepening loneliness by drinking beer and spirits during the daytime, often concealing his alcohol inside his jacket at school. When one of his classmates saw him drinking scotch during a morning history class, Walker simply shrugged his shoulders and said it was my medicine. His grades at school were average, and he did participate in a few extracurricular activities such as tennis, and even worked on the school newspaper. Still, he was largely viewed by classmates as a loner and an alcoholic. Although mostly uncommunicative during his freshman year, Walker was considered polite by teachers who saw him as a highly intelligent young man, albeit one who never seemed interested in applying himself. He did have a date to his school prom, something that surprised both Lionel and Joyce, and later invited her over to his parents' house for a seance. His classmates remembered a stunt Stephen Walker pulled that got him included in the yearbook photo of the National Honor Society, despite him not actually being a member. When the school staff discovered the prank in time, his photo was quickly blacked out. Among his peers, he was seen as a class clown whose bizarre pranks, dubbed by his classmates as doing a Walker, included simulating epileptic seizures at school and in local stores. Upon reaching puberty, Walker discovered that he was gay, but did not reveal this to his parents. He even had a brief relationship with another teenage boy, but the two did not engage in sexual intercourse. By his mid-teens, his fear of abandonment and neglect by loved ones began to manifest itself into a prominent and disturbing sexual fantasy. This became one of his masturbatory fantasies, one that involved dominating and controlling a partner who was completely sexually submissive to his desires. This fantasy gradually developed into a fetish for the torsos and chests of young men, something that became disturbingly intertwined with his growing interest in dissection and death. By the age of 16, Stephen Walker had taken notice of a particular male jogger who regularly passed by his house, and in turn developed a fantasy in which he would render the man unconscious and then explore his body. He even went so far as to lie in wait for the jogger, concealing himself in the bush with a baseball bat. But on that particular day, the jogger never came by. By 1977, Walker's drinking had reached such an extent that his grades began to decline. His parents hired a private tutor, but it had limited success. As he became more passive and withdrawn, his parents were facing a crisis of their own. In an attempt to save their marriage, the Walkers attended counseling sessions, but the arguments persisted. The end came when Lionel learned that Joyce had had a brief affair in September 1977. They decided to divorce, telling their sons that it was an amicable decision. But the divorce soon became bitter. Lionel moved out of the family house in early 1978, and a custody battle ensued over their younger son, David. In May 1978, Stephen graduated from high school. Just a few weeks earlier, he had been caught by a teacher drinking in the school parking lot. When the staff member threatened to report him, Stephen replied that he had a lot of problems at home and was seeing the school's guidance counselor. Around the same time, Joyce Walker, in defiance of a court order, moved out of the family home and took David to live with relatives in Chippewa Falls, Wisconsin. At just 18, Stephen Walker was left alone in the family home. The divorce was finalized by July 1978, with Joyce receiving full custody of David. Lionel Walker soon met his future wife, Shuri, and the two became engaged. Redwood Falls Cannibal, the murder of Mark Rivers. After his failed attempt to ambush and control the male jogger near his home, Stephen Walker continued to spiral deeper into his violent fantasies. These disturbing thoughts centered around dominance, submission, and lifeless bodies would soon lead to something irreversible. 3 weeks after his high school graduation, on June 18, 1978, Walker was driving through the rural outskirts of Redwood Falls when he saw a hitchhiker thumbing for a ride. The young man, Mark Rivers, was almost 19 and heading to a rock concert at Maple Ridge Amusement Park. Mark was athletic and bare-chested, his shirt tied around his waist in the summer heat. The moment Walker saw him, the sexual fantasy that had been simmering in his mind for years surged to the surface. With the house to himself and no one expecting him, Walker offered Mark a ride and the promise of a few beers if he stopped by for a while. Mark agreed. But as they drove, Walker's fantasy began to unravel. Mark talked casually about girls and past relationships, making it painfully clear that he was straight. Walker realized that any kind of advance would be rejected. Still, the two drank together for hours in Walker's house. They listened to music, chatted, and shared more beers. But as the evening dragged on, Mark stood up and said he had to get going. Later, Stephen Walker would say something chillingly simple to explain what happened next. He wanted to leave, and I didn't want him to leave. When Mark Rivers turned his back, Stephen Walker picked up a 10-pound dumbbell and struck him twice on the back of the head. Mark collapsed to the floor, unconscious. Without hesitation, Walker wrapped the metal bar of the dumbbell around the young man's neck and strangled him to death. Once the body lay still, Walker stripped the clothing from it and began to explore. He ran his hands over Mark's chest, fulfilling the fantasy that had consumed him for years before masturbating as he stood over the lifeless body. He remained with the corpse for hours. Eventually, Walker dragged Mark's body to the basement, where it remained untouched until the following day. That morning, with cold detachment, he began the dissection. He used kitchen tools to carve up the remains, placing parts of the body into plastic garbage bags. The dismembered pieces were carried out to a wooded area behind the house, where he buried them in a shallow grave. But even that wasn't the end. Several weeks later, Walker returned to the burial site. He unearthed the decaying remains, removed the remaining flesh from the bones, and kept fragments as a gruesome souvenir. Much as he had done many times before with the corpses of small animals, Stephen Walker used the basic anatomical knowledge he had gathered over the years to strip away every part of Mark Rivers' flesh. He dissolved the soft tissue in acid and flushed the resulting solution down the toilet. What remained were bones clean and brittle. With methodical coldness, Walker used a sledgehammer to crush the bones into fragments, which he then scattered across the woodland behind his home. The only physical evidence left of the crime was Mark's necklace and the knife used to dismember him. Walker disposed of them by throwing both from the West Bath Road Bridge into the Red Maple River, never suspecting they would remain hidden from investigators for decades to come. Meanwhile, his father Lionel Walker and his new wife Shari had no idea that a brutal murder had taken place inside their own home, or that the crime had been so meticulously concealed. Upon their return, Lionel and Shari tried to push Stephen toward a more stable future. They convinced him to enroll in college, and in the fall of 1978, they helped move him into Redwood State University, where he intended to major in business. But Walker lasted only one semester. He spent most of his time alone in his dorm room, drinking heavily and skipping classes. His grades plummeted, and he eventually flunked out. Despite the obvious signs of a severe drinking problem, Stephen refused to seek help. Growing frustrated, Lionel Walker, urged on by Shari, gave his son an ultimatum: find a job or join the military. When Walker refused to take responsibility or seek employment, Lionel drove him to the local recruitment office. In January 1979, Stephen Walker was officially enlisted into the United States Armed Forces. This was only the beginning. Don't miss what comes next in Part 2.